I think it starts the recording.
All right, so today, as some of you know, I returned from Israel this past week. And interestingly, the Torah portion last week was filled with talk about the land and the Holy Land. That was Parshas Eikev. This week's Torah portion in Re'eh shares a verse which some understand to be a biblical obligation, one of the commandments about living in Israel. And there's a discussion among the commentaries whether it is a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael or not. So today, we're going to learn a Talmud which talks a little bit about the unique holiness of the land of Israel and some of the obligations that come along with it. So if you want to follow along on your phone or something, you can on Sefaria. It's Kesubos, daf 110b, middle of the page. We're going to study Kesubos 110b, middle of the page. And over here, the discussion is about families who are traveling and which, when there's a disagreement within the family of what to do and how we deal with that. All right, so you have different families. The family decides they want to move somewhere. Some agree, some disagree. What are the halachas about that? So again, the Mishnah 110b of Kesubos. Says the Mishnah, Hakol malin la'eretz Yisrael, ve'ein hakol motziin, which means a person can force their entire family to go to Israel. If they are not in Israel and they say, we want to move, we'll explain shortly what that means, but they can coerce their family that everyone should go to Israel. But you cannot coerce. What if somebody within the family says, we're living in Israel, they want to leave Israel? They may not coerce their family members to leave Israel. Echad ha'anashim, v'echad anashim, be it men or women, this rule applies to both. And now the Talmud goes into somewhat of a technical idea, but it's important. It's somewhat separate from the first idea. And it talks about the process of the ketubah. So you may be familiar with the concept of a ketubah. What is a ketubah? A ketubah is a marriage document in which the husband enumerates certain obligations that he is taking upon himself to his newly acquired wife. And it includes that if, in the event of divorce, the husband has to pay a certain amount to his wife. So here the Gemara gets into the following question. What if you wrote a certain amount? You said, the Ketubah says you have to pay 100. So you said, I'm going to pay 100 shekels. But what if the term shekel is used for currency, both in Israel and in another place? Do you have to pay the shekel currency of Israel? Or can you pay the shekel currency of something else? Let's say using the dollar by example. Today you have a dollar, you have the American dollar, you have the Canadian dollar. They both go by dollars, right? So, but there's different values to those dollars. So the question is, what dollar can or should the husband pay in the event of divorce with the ketubah? So he says like this. Says the Mishnah. Nasa isha be'eretz Yisrael. If a man married a woman in Israel, the gersha be'eretz Yisrael, and divorces her in Israel. Nosan la mima'os eretz Yisrael. Everyone agrees that you have to pay the currency of Israel, right? That makes sense. Nasa isha be'eretz Yisrael. If a person marries a woman in Israel, but then the gersha be'kaputkia, and divorces her in kapotkia. What is kapotkia? It is been identified with Cappadocia, an ancient province in Asia Minor. Some say it's connected to modern day Turkey. Okay, so he married her in Israel, but then divorced her in Kappadocia. Now she says, you owe me the ketubah. So he says, nevertheless, the Mishnah says, you still have to pay her the shekel value of Israel, where the ketubah document was written. Nasa isha b'kaputkia. What if a man married a woman in Kaputkia, but then they moved to Israel, the Gersh of Eretz Yisrael, and now he divorces her in Eretz Yisrael? Says the Mishnah, Nosan Lam, Eretz Yisrael. Again, you can pay, or the husband pays, the currency of Israel. So whether if the marriage happened in Israel, divorce happened in Kaputkia, says the Mishnah, there you give the currency of Israel. The marriage happened in Kaputkia, and then the divorce happened in Israel. Again, you give her the currency of Israel. Nasa Isha, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, sorry, Shimon Gamliel says no. That in the event that you married her in Kaputkia, and now you're divorcing in Israel, you nevertheless have to give her Mimaos Kaputkia. You have to give the currency of Kaputkia. And the Mishnah concludes, Nasa Isha Bekaputkia, Begersha Bekaputkia, if he married a woman in Kaputkia, and then divorced her in Kaputkia, then all agree, Nosan Lam Mimaos Kaputkia, then you have to give the money, the currency of Kaputkia. So if you married and divorced in Israel, the ksuba money is Israeli currency. You married and divorced in Kaputkia, the ksuba money is Kaputkian currency. Then, however, the two other scenarios, if a person marries in Israel and divorces in Kaputkia, again, Israeli currency. But if you married in Kaputkia and divorced in Israel, here you have a disagreement. One opinion, the Mishnah says you can give Israeli currency, and Rosh Gamliel says no. You go by where the marriage was. The marriage happened in Kaputkia. You have to give Kaputkia currency. And we'll see. We'll get into the Gemara. The logic behind the disagreement over here.
How come in the Tuba in Israel, when you marry in Israel, the Tuba in Israel, you can do it in American dollars?
The ksuba in Israel, what do you mean you can do it?
You can write the amount in American dollars.
So I think the issue is like this. If you spell out very clearly what currency you're talking about, that's not a problem. In other words, called Tanai Shavimam and Kaim. Anytime you make a condition when it comes to monetary issues in the document, it's fine. So if I very clearly write in the ketubah that in the event of divorce, I will pay, 5,000 Russian ruble, that's fine because I made it clear. The question over here is when it's not clear. When you use a vague term, like I said, use the term dollars, which could be American dollars, it could be Canadian dollars. So that's where this halacha comes in. But the example you're saying, the only way I could see that is if you're talking about someone who writes very clearly that it'll be the dollar. So then, yes, whatever currency you specify is fine because it's just a financial obligation. So that's what you're talking. Okay, I'm going to jump around a little bit over here. And I'm going to jump to the second portion of the Gemara. It says over here, okay, actually, let's go to the first portion of the Gemara. Let's go right into the Gemara. The Gemara says, Hakol Mali, that a person may force all of the members of their household to join them. You're living outside of Israel, and a person says, I want to move to Israel. So the spouse or the children say, we don't want to go. So they go to the Jewish court. The Jewish court says, no, he has a right to take his whole family and move together to Eretz Yisrael. Lasuyimai. Who was this coming to include? When you say you may bring everyone along. La'asuye avad. Who can you force, so to say? If you're forced to go to Israel, this comes to include servants. That if a person has a servant, and the servant says it's a Jewish servant, we have Jewish servants in the times of the Torah talks about Jewish servants. And the servant says, I'm not interested in going. Basin says, no, you have to go along to Israel. Okay? And then Gemara says, according to another opinion which says, basically, it says clearly that servants go along. So then the word hakol over here must be including someone else. So Gemara says, it's coming to teach the following. That even if a person says to his spouse, or a woman says to her spouse, I want to move to Israel, and the house that we're going to move to in Israel, or the area we're going to move to in Israel, is a much smaller home. So you would think that in that situation, you shouldn't be able to impose upon your spouse to move to Israel. Nevertheless, the Mishnah says you're allowed to impose. Even if you're going from a nicer dwelling to a lesser dwelling, you're still allowed to impose this idea of moving to the land. We're going to talk in a minute what it means to impose. How can you force someone to move? Is that even a thing? What does that mean? You ought to chain them up and take them? Yes.
So my quick question is, if you're not making any carnals in Israel, but then you have another spot where you're about to go broke in Israel, what's the proper protocol?
Okay.
I don't know if I jumped ahead.
No. So a little bit, there's two questions here. The question is, if you don't have Parnasa in Eretz Yisrael and you have a good job outside of Israel, so then there's two questions here. First question is it appropriate to leave Eretz Yisrael in order to find a livelihood?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes. The second question is, and this is what over here we're just talking about, can you impose it upon your family? Can you impose and say, well, I have to move, so therefore my family has to move along with me? And that's what we're going to get to in a minute. So there's two separate questions. The first question is, can you move? For us, the answer is yes.
Wait, so clarifying, is Rabban Shimon saying that upon divorcing, the husband uses the currency from the country of original marriage?
Correct. From the country where the document was issued. That's, which, as you can see, makes sense. Because when you read a document, the document which said you owe such and such money is the location where the document was written makes the most sense. That's what the currency should be used.
That's only if he didn't stipulate.
If it wasn't stipulated clearly, correct.
Didn't we say like if they were written, like the marriage was like the and then they went to Eretz Yisrael, they would have to pay in Israeli currency?
Not according to Rosh Gamliel.
Oh, okay.
That's the first one opinion of the Mishnah. The other opinion says no, you follow the currency of where the ketubah was written. Okay, Dein Hakol Motziin. Then the Mishnah goes on to say, and you may not force anybody to leave Israel with you. Who's that coming to? Who's that coming to include? It says the Ein Hakol Motziin. Who is the Gemara referring to? The Gemara says, this is an interesting halacha. La'asuye, this comes to include Eved shebarach michutz la'aretz la'aretz. A servant who runs away from out of Israel and runs into Israel. Da'aminanle, we tell the owner, the master, you may not force your servant to come back and work for you. Rather, either you can find someone to take him in Israel or let him go. It's a very interesting thing. Again, the concept today of servants and slaves is not something which we are very comfortable with, but it was throughout human history, servants and slaves was the norm. And Judaism had a very compassionate approach towards servants, much more so than any other society had. And here you have one example of it, and that pretty much any slave who was able to run away and run to Israel, that was their ticket to freedom. Because once a slave or a servant who runs to Israel, we tell the master, the master goes to court. The owner says, this is my slave. No matter, this person ran to Israel, you're out of Israel, and therefore we're not going to force anybody, even a slave who ran away, we're not going to force them back into servitude.
What about Eved Olam?
Doesn't matter, so they're talking about every time, yeah. Okay.
But he basically by committing to be Eved Olam is not changing the vow, changing the.
It could be, but this is a little loophole. This is a loophole to get out of the servitude. We never force someone to leave Israel, even if they were a servant. We don't force them to leave Israel.
But it needs like a permission from rabbis or for Atarat Nedarim or something to do that, no?
I don't know. It's a good question. That's a good question over here. Now the Gemara says, there's the next part of the Mishnah, which is within Israel itself. So until now, we've been talking about that a person may coerce a family member to go to Israel with them. Within Israel itself, we have this idea of Hakol Mal Yerushalayim. A person can impose upon their family members within Israel itself, you have to move to Yerushalayim. La'asuye mai, what is this coming to include? And again, the Gemara says the same exact logic as we said earlier. La'asuye minava hayafa l'navara. Again, that even if a husband or a wife tells their spouse, we're moving to Jerusalem, and we're downsizing. We have a 5-bedroom house, and now we're going to move into a 3-bedroom house. And the spouse says, how can you do that to me? No, because the holiness of just like Israel is holier than the rest of the world, Yerushalayim is holier than the rest of Israel. And a family member can impose upon their family to move, to join them and move into Yerushalayim. But let's talk about what it means to impose upon someone. How could a husband or a wife impose upon their spouse to move? I mean, how can you force that? It's not an issue you can force. Are you literally allowed to physically move them?
The idea can be the house.
Correct. So now we're going to explain what it means that you can impose upon a spouse to move. It doesn't literally mean that you can force someone and force them into the car or the plane and say, we're going. That's not what it means. Here's what it means. Yeah, you had a question? Okay. Here's what it means. Tana Rabbah. Now the Gemara explains what it means to force. I'm jumping a little bit if you're following the Tana Rabbah. Now the sages taught as follows. Hu Omer Lalos. The husband says, I want to go to Israel. Or in Israel, I want to go to Yerushalayim. Vihi Omer Shalala. And she says, I'm not interested in going. So then, we say they come to court, and he says, I want to go. She says, I'm not interested in going. So the first thing we do is we tell her, you have to go. Your husband wants to make a aliyah. He wants to go to a better place spiritually. You have to go. But if she doesn't want to go, so then, again, it doesn't mean she can be forced, but in lav, takes a below. So what it means is in lav, then we say, okay, well, then he has a right to divorce you without paying the ketubah. So that's what it means impose. Impose means that he can go up, and if she says she doesn't want to go, the first thing we say is you have to go. And if she doesn't, we say, okay, well, then he has the right to divorce you and not pay the ketubah. The ketubah is basically the financial obligation he takes upon himself in case of divorce. But there are exceptions to the rule of ketubah. If a woman does something which is highly inappropriate, in other words, if she gives him a strong reason to divorce her, then we say he's no longer obligated to pay the ketubah. So that's what it means he can force his hand. In other words, he can force to say, either you come with me, and if you don't, I'm going to divorce you and I don't have to pay you the ketubah. That's the meaning of him forcing her. What about the other way around? How can she force him? So Gemara continues. He omeres lotzes. And I'm sorry. He omeres la'alos. She says, I want to go to Israel, or in Israel, I want to go to Yerushalayim. V'hu omer shalolos. And he says, I don't want to go up. So they go to Basin. Basin says, Kofar shalalos. So the Basin says, no, you have to go up. Your wife wants to go up to Israel. That's a upgrade, or in Israel, so if your wife wants to go to Yerushalayim, that is a spiritual upgrade. You have to go with her. Bein lam. And if he says, no, I don't want to, then Yotzi v'yitin ksuba, then the Basin can force him to give her a divorce and to pay her. So that's what it means to force. Force means that each spouse has the ability to force their hand. The wife says, well, if you don't want to come with me, then I'm requiring you to divorce me and pay the ketubah. And the flip side of that is that if the husband says, I don't want to go up, or if she says, I don't want to go up, and the Basin says, well, then he has the right to divorce you and not give it to you.
According to Allah, a woman divorce her husband?
She can cause the Basin to impose the divorce, which means they force it to happen.
In this case,
technically, a divorce has to come from the husband. In other words, he has to give the divorce to the wife. But in circumstances where the wife wants to divorce and he doesn't want it, this is obviously the source of challenging situations such as an aguna, or so that's where Basin comes in, and they could force it to happen with various meetings. So there's Basin forces it to happen, depending on the strength of the Basin. They could even imprison him until he does. So but this would be a circumstance where the Basin forces. And the key over here is that they force him to also pay the ketubah. Not only to give the divorce, but force him to pay the ketubah. The flip side of that, till now, again, this is somewhat repetitive, but now what about the same concept about leaving Israel?
Why, by the way, it's not happening today? You hear all these stories of women that don't get the gift from.
Because there's limited powers in Basin. Based on his limited powers.
But the Bedouin can still force it.
How?
I'm not saying beating him or doing something, but like to talk to him in order until he says
So
yes.
that happens. But then at the end of the day, the a person has to do it. And today, Basins don't have the same power they used to have, and therefore there are times in which he refuses even to go to Basin.
So there is no way around it. He needs to say the word.
There's no way around it other than him giving the divorce. Correct. There is no way around it, and that's the challenge today. That's why today we have a new concept, relatively new concept, called a halachic prenup. I know we're going a little bit off topic over here. The halachic prenup is in order to avoid this circumstance in which the husband before marriage binds himself legally that in the event that his wife wants a divorce, he is refusing to give it, he is obligated by whatever legal system he is under to pay $1,000 a day until he gives the divorce. So that is a pretty strong coercion, and that is legally binding. So according to the American legal system, if she says I want a divorce and he says I'm not giving it, so then he has to pay $1,000 a day, and that usually does the job. Make sure that he gives it. Anyway, this is perhaps the greatest halachic challenge today in the world is this issue. So today, and they're always, yeah. Now, just continuing on that topic, until now he said if one of the spouses wants to go up to. Now, what about if one of them wants to leave Israel? It's the same logic, just the other way around. So, she says, I want to leave Israel. I'm living here. I'm not happy here. Too many government restrictions. He says, she says, I want to leave Israel. But who I don't want to leave. So the first thing we say is, you shouldn't leave. Your husband wants to stay here. Israel is a holier land. In love, and again, if she's adamant that I need to leave, we say, okay, fine, you can leave, but you have lost the right to the ketubah. Who Omer Latzes? He says, I want to leave. She says, I don't want to leave. So again, we tell him you shouldn't leave. You're not allowed to leave. In love, and if he's adamant about it, then we say you have to divorce her and give her a ketubah.
If one of the reasons he wants to go out of Israel is for Parnassan.
Okay. Oh, so now let's get back to the question. Right. So this goes back to your point, which is the question the Prime asked earlier, which is if he wants to leave for Parnassan. So I would assume, based on this Gemara, that even if we say he is allowed to leave, but I think this Gemara still applies. If he wants to leave for Parnassan, and she says, "I'm sorry, I don't want to leave," so I think this halacha would still apply. You can force him to because even though you're allowed to leave, but she still has the right to say, "No, we'll stay here. We'll find Parnassan here. We'll figure it out." So I think this Gemara would apply even when a person has a right to leave. This Gemara would still apply that the spouse who says, "I want to stay," or whichever spouse says, "I want to stay," or "I want to go up to Israel," the Beis Din gives them the rights when it comes to divorce, when it comes to the ketubah. Okay, now let's go to the other topic the Mishnah brought up, which was when you do have a marriage in one country and a divorce in another country, what currency is the ketubah paid from? So Gemara says this question. There seems to be a contradiction in the Mishnah. The Mishnah seems to contradict itself. On one hand, it says, Katani, Nasa Isha Be'eretz Yisrael V'gersha B'kaputkia. The first statement is, you marry a woman in Israel, and then the divorce happens in Kaputkia. Nosan Lami Moshe Yisrael. You pay the ketubah money is from the currency of Israel. Alma, that seems to imply Basar Shibuda Azlina. We go by the initial location where the initial obligation was placed. The initial obligation of the ketubah, where it was written. When you write a document, again, let's use simple terminology. If you and I have a business deal and we wrote the document here in the US, And it said that I will give you, or I'm obligating myself to, and if such and such happens, I'm going to give you $150. And I wrote that in the US. And then we moved to Canada. And the event happens in Canada. And now you come to me and say, well, it was written $150. Do I pay with American dollars or Canadian dollars? So the first half of this is American dollars. Why? Because that's where the obligation was written, right? So that's what the Mishnah seems to indicate. Right, that you give where the obligation was written. Ema Seifa, but if you go to the second half of the Mishnah, it says, Nasa Isha Bekaputki, that if you married a woman in Kaputki, Beger Sheveres Yisrael, and then you divorced her, and then the divorce happens in Israel. Nasa Lama Oser Yisrael, then we pay from the money of Eretz Yisrael. Alma, that contradicts that statement. Alma, Basar Guvayna Azlina. We go not by the initial obligation, but where the collection is happening. Again, in that situation, we would say collect with Canadian money. You go by the collecting location, not by the contract location. Which is it? The Mishnah seems to indicate both. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, Mikule Ksuba Shana. From here we see that the sages were lenient with regards to the Ketubah. Why? Kasavar Ketuba Dirabanan. The opinion over here is that the ketubah is rabbinic and it is not a Torah obligation. However, Shimon ben Gamliel says no. Nosim mima'os kaputia. You have to give the ketubah. If it was written, if the ketubah, the marriage happened in kaputia, that's the money you have to give. Kasabar ketubah d'oraisa. Obviously, he's of the opinion that the ketubah is a Torah law. So I don't want to get caught up in the technicalities of from which place the money has to come from, whether it's the currency of the location of the document was written, or the currency of the location of the document was collected. But I do want to focus for a moment on this point, which is important. Everyone knows about the ketubah, right? You hear about the ketubah. When you get married, you make a beautiful ketubah, and you read it under the wedding. What is the ketubah? The ketubah is that the husband takes upon himself that in the case of divorce, he will pay a certain amount. Is that a Torah obligation or a rabbinic obligation? So you have a disagreement among the sages whether it's Torahic or rabbinic. As it turns out, the Torah is not very clear about it, and that's why there's room to say that it's a Torah obligation, because the Torah doesn't say very clearly when a man marries a woman, he has to give her a ketubah. But there is a source for it in the Torah, so some say that it becomes a Torah obligation, some say even though there's a source in the Torah, because it's not written clearly, it remains a rabbinic obligation. Okay, let's get back to the topic at hand, which is the idea of living in Eretz Yisrael, and the significance of living in Israel. I'm going to jump a little bit to a text. Tanu Rabbanan, towards the bottom of the page. Tanu Rabbanan, the sages live. The next section of the Talmud talks about the importance of living, of the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. It says the sages, La'olam yadur adam be'eretz Yisrael. A person should live in Eretz Yisrael. Afilu be'ir sheruba ovdei kochavim, even if it means living in a city whose majority is idol worship. Be'al yadur b'chutz la'aretz, and one should not live outside of Israel. Afilu be'ir sheruba Yisrael, even in a city whose most of its inhabitants are Jewish, righteous inhabitants. Why? And you'll see some very strong statements here. Shekol hadar be'eretz Yisrael, anyone who lives in the land of Israel, domek k'mishi yeshlo alokah, is like they are truly living with God. B'chol hadar b'chutz la'aretz, and one who lives outside of Israel, domek k'mishi ein alokah. It's as if, to some degree, they're living without God. So Talmud emphasizes the idea that living in Israel is like living properly with God, and living outside of Israel, one lacks relationship with God. The rabbis that wrote these statements lived outside of Israel. Correct. And we're going to see in a moment. We're going to get to a part of the Gemara which throws a little bit of a twist into all this. Yes, the sages who are writing this did not live in Israel. They lived in Babylon. We'll get to that in a minute. That as the pasuk that says, I will give you the land of Canaan to be for you a God. Yeah, which implies I will give you the land of Canaan to be for you a God. And somehow the pasuk seems to be saying that living in Canaan, which is eventually Israel, is directly associated with living with God, the presence of God. You're going to suggest that one who dwells outside of Israel is without God, and God is everywhere. The Gemara says, that over here it associates living outside of Israel with idolatry. And he quotes also from David, who Omer ki gershuni hayom yistapeach b'nachas Hashem lemelcha lavod elokim achir. So the Gemara says, so now, okay, so we have this very strong statement. You have to live in Israel. As Matan pointed out, this statement was said by people who did not live in Israel. So how are we to reconcile not only the fact that this statement was said by people who live in Babylonia, but throughout Jewish history? I mean, right now we're sitting and studying this in West Bloomfield, Michigan. And people have studied, and you have sages for 2,000 years in which we haven't lived in Israel, and we didn't necessarily make every effort to live in Israel. So let's see what the rest of the Gemara says. Reb Zera, Hava Kamishtamit Minei Reb Yehuda. Rabbi Zera was a student of Rabbi Yehuda, and he was avoiding his teacher, Rabbi Yehuda. Why was he avoiding his teacher? Because Reb Zera was looking to move to Israel, and he knew that his teacher would be opposed to it. How do we understand that the teacher of Reb Zera would be opposed to moving to Israel after everything we just said? Living in Eretz Yisrael is like living with God. Living outside of Eretz Yisrael is missing God. So why would Rabbi Yehuda be opposed to Reb Zera moving to Israel? The Amar Rabbi Yehuda said, Kol ha'olam miBavel le'Eretz Yisrael oiver ba'aseh. Anybody who goes from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, now we have a statement from Yehuda who says, whoever goes up from Israel, from Bavel to Israel, is transgressing a positive commandment. That basically now we have the exact opposite. Suddenly we have Rabbi Yehuda's opinion who says that if you're in Bavel, in Babylonia at the time, and you go to Israel, you're transgressing a Torah commandment. Shenemar, because the pasuk states, Yirmiyah, this is Yirmiyah who talks about the destruction of the temple. Bavel yavo'u, that to Bavel you will go, the Shama Yihi, and there you will stay, God says, Ad Yom Pakti Osanu Mashem, until the day that I will bring you back. So now suddenly we have this new idea that yes, it's true, everything we said until this point, that living in Israel is a mitzvah, not just a mitzvah, but it's living with God. But now we have a new pasuk which indicates that all that is true in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. But now that we're in exile, now we have this statement that no, now God says you've been sent to Babylonia. And at this point, you have to wait there until I come and get you back out of it. So that's where Yehuda fell. And therefore, Reb Zera, who was his student, was hiding the fact that he planned on going to Israel. But now the question is, how did Reb Zera plan to go to Israel? I mean, forget about his teacher. If the verse states that you should not go from Babel to Israel, why was he planning to go?
Because that's only in the 70 years.
So that's precisely what Tosfos mentioned. One of the commentaries in the Gemara, Tosfos says, Af al gav the high kra begolus rishon. Exactly what you just brought up. Even though that verse is referring to the first exile of Galus, Yesh lomar the begolus sheni namid kabik. Basically, Tosfos says it must be. Rabbi Yehuda said that yes, even though that statement was technically recited about Baal, it was a statement which was meant to be understood about all subsequent exiles. That when we are sent into exile, then there has to be a divine message of return. So that's an excellent point. But Tosfos says that it must be Yehuda understood it about not just that exile, but all exiles, that when we are sent into exile, it's God's way of saying you're in exile until there's a divine calling to return. Now, what exactly is that divine calling? It's a good question too. But there has to be a divine calling.
Does he believe that the Babels are home during each exile or just the first one?
Bavel was the center of Torah. at that point. So I don't think Bavel, I don't know. I don't know if we would, I don't know if we would then say that Bavel becomes the only alternative to Israel. At that point, once it's exile, it's exile. And then as long as the Torah center was Bavel, then that became the place where a person has to be.
If you believe in the center of Torah,
As long as God, there hasn't been a ad yom pakti, which means until the day that I will attend to them, whatever that means. That there's a day in which God says, I will bring you back from the exile. Until that point, stay where you are. Now this raises a question the other way around, right? Now that we read this, we say, wait a second. So how come there are Jews in Israel? And there always have been, not only in the last 7 years where we have a Jewish state, but even 500 years ago, we had the great sages often moved to Israel, the Ramban and then the Arizal and the Yosef. So you see already that this topic is not so clear. Reb Zera, how would he understand this verse? Again, he says that Reb Yehuda had a pasuk which says, go to Babel and stay there. Then why would Reb Zera have the audacity to violate that verse? Says Reb Zera, who the klisharis? Zera says, no, that's not referring to the people. That's talking about the vessels of the temple. The verse over there is talking about the vessels of the temple, that the vessels should go down to Babel, and there they should stay. But people, Reb Zera, they could go back. So the Gemara says, wait a second. Rabbi Yehuda would say, Ksiv Kra Achrina. Yehuda says, I have a separate verse. If you're going to ascribe this verse to say that the vessel shouldn't go back, I have a separate verse. Hishpati es nemenosh Yerushalayim, b'tzva also be'elos hasada. He says, I have a different verse which says that we are bound not to go back to Eretz Yisrael. So Zera says, it's true. There is a verse which clearly states you should not go back to Israel. However, and this is an important statement, Hahu shelo yalu Yisrael b'choma. That means, or Zera says, even though I agree with you that there's a verse which indicates you should not go back to Israel, but that just means the Jewish people should not forcibly as an army go back to Israel. But I, as an individual, could go back to Israel. So now you have a new understanding of the idea of going back to Israel. Now, Reb Zera says that there's a distinction that an individual who wants to go back can go back, but as an army, we should not go back as an army and conquer the land of Israel. That's Reb Zera's understanding of the verse which says don't go back. So now, let's pause here for a moment and pose the following question. According to Reb Zera, who distinguishes between an individual going back and an army going back, what about the current state of Israel?
Good.
Is it a problem or not? What's that?
Good.
So you're saying, okay, so just to expand a little bit on your point of pikuach nefesh, it's in order to save lives. But today, the reason why it's okay that there was the conquest of Israel is okay is because it was needed to save lives. I mean, 2,000 years of exile and the Holocaust proved that we just need a place, not necessarily because we need to conquer the Holy Land, but simply we need a place to live.
Okay, so why Israel?
Okay, so why Israel?
No, it's because we had nowhere else to go.
You have Uganda.
No, we're talking about 1948.
Yeah.
1947.
The Jews didn't like invade Israel.
So now Jeff brings up another point, which is the Jewish, these are all points which are brought up, and I'm not going to give anything conclusive because there's many opinions here, and they're very passionate opinions. But there is the suggestion which Alia says, which is pikuach nefesh. Once it's pikuach nefesh, once you're doing it not as because we need to be in the Holy Land, but rather we need a place to protect ourselves to save a life. Saving lives overrides all the mitzvahs. Even if theoretically we should not be going and conquering Eretz Yisrael, but if it's for the purpose of saving lives, then it overrides that mitzvah. So then you're like, oh, now you're saying it could be anywhere. Okay, it could be anywhere, but it could also be there. In other words, why shouldn't we go there if that's the place where it can save lives? Now, but
It's not my opinion.
right, it's an opinion. Now Jeffrey brought up an opinion, another point, which is that if you look at the history, there was never a Jewish army which went and conquered the land of Israel. That's not how it happened. They petitioned to be given the state of Israel, which they were, and then they had to defend it. That's very different than going up and conquering the land.
Couldn't you say if Hashem didn't want it, then he wouldn't have made it possible?
Can we really say that? I mean, say that about, about anything which, anytime an individual does something wrong, that means that God made it possible to do something wrong.
Make it last as long?
What? I know, but that's not that's not a halachic argument. That's a nice philosophical argument. That's not a halachic argument. Now, but my point is that and then there are some, this is a minority, but there are today, when you hear that within some Hasidic groups, there is a anti-Zionist feeling, it's based on this concept. It is a minority, but there is this idea, and some are more outspoken than others. So that's why I don't want to say in Torah Karta. Torah Karta took it to an extreme level, which is absurd, which now they are protesting, linking arms with those who killed Jewish people. So but there are those who are more sensible and nevertheless rely on this Gemara to say that the Jewish people should not have gone in and conquered Rome. It is the minority because, again, most opinions today have different explanations as to why the land of Israel doesn't contradict this Gemara. But I'm saying now you see why it's a complex topic.
They don't follow the Shlosh Shavuot.
What? They don't follow the 3 Shavuot. Who doesn't follow?
The people that basically don't want to go.
Okay.
The people who live in Israel. Don't
So
follow.
Matan just brought up an idea of 3 Shavuot. What's 3 Shavuot? The 3 oaths. Anybody ever heard of the 3 oaths? This is the Gemara right here. What are the 3 oaths that you just brought up? So Reb Zera, again, going back to Reb Zera and Reb Yehuda, who had this disagreement whether they should go to Israel or not. Reb Zera says, we have 3 oaths. We have the following opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Chanina the Amar, who says, this is a fascinating Gemara. Gimel Shavuos Halalu Lama. We have this idea that in Shir Hashirim and in Yirmiyah, God says, Hishbati Eschem Benos Yerushalayim. I took an oath with you, the daughters of Jerusalem. Daughters of Jerusalem are referring to the Jewish people here. So God says, I took an oath with you. And we find 3 different times where we come across the words, this idea of this oath. What were the 3 oaths? Lama. What were the 3 oaths that God made with the Jewish people when they were sent into exile? Achas, one of the oaths was Shelo Yalu Yisrael B'chama, that the Jewish people should not go by force and conquer the Holy Land until Mashiach comes. The Achas, a second oath, which the Jewish people were told to observe. She'eshliach Kadosh Baruch Hu es Yisrael, that God made the Jewish people promise, so to say, Shelo Yimradu Ba'uma Sa'olam, that they should not revolt against the nations of the world, your host nations when you're in exile. God says you're going into exile, and you should not revolt against the nations under whom you are cast. So if you end up in whichever country you may be in, the Jews should not assemble as an army and try to overthrow their host nation. That was oath number 2. And oath number 3, the Achas, Shehishpia Kadosh Baruch Hu es Ovdei Kochavim, that God took an oath with the nations of the world, Shelo Yishtabdu Bahem Yisrael Yosemidai, that the nations of the world were told that you may not even though God says, I'm sending the Jewish people into exile under your control, you may not subjugate them more than necessary. They're in exile, but it does not give you a right to persecute the Jewish people. So we have this idea that when the Jewish people went into exile, there were 3 oaths taken, 2 to the Jewish people and 1 to the rest of the world. 1 is the Jewish people were taking an oath by God saying they will not they will not go and conquer the Holy Land. 2, they will not revolt against the hosts, the nations under which they will be exiled. And the 3rd one is that the nations of the world took an oath not to persecute the Jewish people who were sent into exile. So this is what's famously known in the topic of Israel as the Shlosha Shavuos, the 3 oaths. But Rav Zera still contended that this has nothing to do with an individual who wants to go out to Israel. This has to do with only the nation that you want to conquer as a nation. However, as some of you may know, there is within the world of Zionism, you have secular Zionism and you have religious Zionism. And religious Zionism, famously Rav Kook was the first chief rabbi of modern Israel. He was a religious Zionist. So there are many religious Zionists who said, nonetheless, no, we should be going into Israel. We should be trying to create a state which seems to go against this Talmud. The Talmud seems to say pretty clearly, you should not try to force a Jewish state, and yet the Jewish people did. So how do we reconcile? How do we reconcile? According to those who say that we should have a state, or we should be conquering a state, how do you reconcile with this Talmud?
But again, it's what Jeffrey said.
Which is what?
The idea.
It's okay, but there is a weakness in that argument, because if you look at the history, there was a concerted effort to conquer, right? If you go look at the history of 1945 to 1948, the underground, the Haganah, and the Irgun, they were all fighting to conquer the land. No. It was a combined effort to get rid of the British.
It was for survival. It wasn't for conquering the land.
So now you're going back to the survival argument. In other words, it was a conquest of the land to a degree, which they were successful at. And it's also, to say that there was no effort, a military effort, I think is a bit of a stretch. There was a military effort.
Your answer is in 1948. Who started the war? The Israelis, was peacefully wanted to live in the land the United Nations gave them.
Right. Okay. You can use that argument again.
The
Yes.
third oath is applying to nations.
Correct.
So could you argue that perhaps they didn't abide by their oath, therefore we don't have to?
This is very good. This is one of the answers given. One of the answers given is like this: that if you have two people who sign an agreement, and you have two people, each side agrees to certain parts of that agreement. I say I will commit myself to such and such, and you say you will commit yourself to such and such. That's the binding agreement. The halacha is that once you break your part of the agreement, I am no longer bound to my part of it. As if this document, if this contract is based on your agreement and my agreement, so then once you've broken your half, I am no longer obligated to mine. So therefore, the third oath over here was that the nations of the world promise. The oath of the nations of the world is that we will not be overly persecute. We won't persecute the Jewish people who are our subjects. Well, that clearly wasn't kept. So once that part was broken, so our half of the oath is also now. So that's one explanation. But a more common explanation given to those who say that we should be going and conquering the land is that these 3 shavuos, the 3 oaths, it falls in the category of agadah, which means it's hard to take it very literally. Who exactly took this oath? Was there ever a gathering of the Jewish people in which God had the Jewish people take an oath? There was never an actual oath taken. It's not as if on the eve of exile, the Jewish people gathered, and the nations of the world gathered. And God said, when we stood by Sinai, we took an oath. We said, Nasa v'nishma, we will do it. There was a very clear commitment. In this situation, this whole Gemara is kind of strange, because it's clearly not speaking in a very practical level that there was never an oath taken. Rather, it's an agadah. Agadah in Gemara, like we've studied previously about the journeys of Rav Rochana, there's a whole section of Gemara which shares important, interesting ideas, but if it's not a halachic idea, it doesn't necessarily become halachically binding. And therefore, many say, yes, this Gemara is true, and it's a nice Gemara, but it is not halachically binding. And you don't find this Gemara brought down in halacha. It's not like it's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch or it's brought down in the Rambam. None of the codifiers of halacha actually bring this Gemara down, understandably, because it's hard to understand this as a halachic Gemara. In Gemara, there's a difference between halacha, which is clear, practical direction of what you can and can't do, and Agada, which is more the allegory and the parables, which certainly share messages, but don't necessarily become binding Jewish law. So many commentators say this Gemara is nice, but you can't qualify it as binding Jewish law. And that's the second approach. And then again, there's a third approach that I mentioned earlier of certain sects, certain groups of people who do say this Gemara continues to carry weight. And that's when you have certain groups which still continue to have opposition to the idea of currently having a Jewish land, because there's some who say it still goes against this Gemara. And finally, there's another approach which says, what does the verse say? The verse states, you should be in Babel, there you be ad yom pakti esem, until the day I will attend to you or I will call out to you. Well, what does that mean? What is the definition of calling out to you? So there's some who say that the miracles that took place at the foundation of the modern state of Israel, whether it was 1948 or 1967, is precisely the meaning of this verse, is precisely the actualization of the verse, Ad Yom Pakti Osam Hashem, the day that I will call you, I will attend to you. Well, that's what's happening in our lifetimes, the miracles which allow for the creation of the modern state of Israel. So here we just have, again, I'm not drawing any conclusions because you have many different opinions in this topic. And if you want to dive into it further, you can. There's books and there's ideas which share more about it. But this Gemara right here, which we just studied, both shares the awesome holiness of Israel, so much so that a family member can impose upon the rest of the family saying, I'm going, you have to come with me. At the same time, the same Gemara continues and says, well, wait a second, once we're in exile, Rabbi Yehuda says, you're not allowed to go to Israel. So you have this unique approach in the Talmud, which leads itself to many different opinions, which very practically expresses itself in Jewish opinions today, and even in the decisions that some make when it comes to going to Eretz Yisrael or not, depending on how we understand this Gemara and how what conclusion we draw from. All right, stop here. God willing, join me again next Thursday, 8:10.